Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. I'm Walter Isaacson, and we are going to be answering all those questions you posed, because 100 years ago, when the automobile came into the cities, it not only transformed how we move, it transformed how cities were built. The real question is this another once-in-a-century inflection point when we get autonomous vehicles? To be on the panel with us, we have two really brilliant people in this field. Seleta Reynolds is the general manager of the Los Angeles Department of Transportation. Mayor Garcetti was able to steal you from San Francisco, if I remember correctly, and that's a good thing. And then Edward Humes wrote the book, The Door-to-Door, The Magnificent, Maddening, Mysterious World of Transportation. And last night, I did read the chapter on autonomous vehicles, which was great, and I'll try to read the whole thing on the plane ride back, but it was a really fun description of what cars had done to us. Why don't we start with the question the mayor posed, which is, why is this really going to be all that different than a city in which there are cab drivers and Uber drivers to have the cars drive autonomously? Why will that be a sea change?
Well, I think that when you drop these things into the models without any public policy agenda, he's right. It's not that different. And in fact, vehicle miles traveled goes up, congestion increases. There's no disincentive to sit in hours of congestion, so you can wake up at 3 in the morning and curl up in your robot overlord, and it will drive you in congestion for several hours to get to your job. So absolutely, there has to be a public policy agenda driven by cities that gets to the outcomes that we want, because I think those outcomes are within our grasp. And I think it actually doesn't change a public policy toolbox all that much from things that we've been talking about for years around
Well,
pricing.
give me 3 public policies you would want.
So I think, number one, we have to have a serious conversation about pricing, how we price both the rides people take and the infrastructure that they use, particularly as the gas tax erodes or disappears. Parking revenue may not be available to us in the future either. Second, we need
You also lose speeding tickets, which is the main source of revenue in my home state.
I take no position on your statement. But as the person who oversees parking in Los Angeles, I know parking citations deliver about $160 million every year to the city budget. And that doesn't fund transportation. It funds police, it funds fire, it funds parks and libraries. So there'll be a real reckoning around pricing. Second, I think that there needs to be a radical re-envisioning of public transit. We are going to be driven out of business if we continue to rely on the public transit business model that we have. I think high-capacity rail will be critical, but surface transit, buses, and the like need a really hard look. And then
But wait, should autonomous vehicles and public transit be one system?
I think so. And I think that the public transit system starts to look more like several different sizes of vehicles that deliver that service at different times of day. But if we let the private side drive that conversation, it's really hard to avoid puns in transportation. But if we let the private side drive that conversation, they'll go to Venice and the West Side in Los Angeles, but they may not go to Boyle Heights and Pacoima and Van Nuys. So delivering transit as a public good, I think, is in concessioning that transit.
So wait, and before you go, so are you saying that the autonomous vehicles should be told how to operate by the government as opposed to individuals?
I think that government can concession that service, and then the sort of public transit goes where the demand is. So it may change its route in the evening. It may go from a 40-foot articulated bus down to a 12-person van that operates
differently. But suppose I want a little car to take me from here, from door to door, as you know, was said in the book.
I think those services will still exist, you know, but that's where pricing becomes important. I need to be able to price that trip more than if you were sharing a ride with me and Ed to go from door-ish to door-ish.
You know, one of the things people worry about on autonomous vehicles is they may be dangerous. I'm afraid to be in one, people say. You, of course, make the exact opposite argument, which I tend to agree with, which is if I get into a car with somebody else driving, I'm scared. If I get into an autonomous vehicle, I'm going to feel safer.
Oh, yeah, well, the worst designed, flawed part of any car today is the human behind the wheel, but we can't actually recall human drivers. But in a sense, if driverless technology becomes ubiquitous, that is the recall of this great flaw in our transportation system. But getting to the point where driverless technology is ubiquitous is like fraught with obstacles, potential dangers. We already see this phenomenon that the Google car has experienced of being bullied by human drivers, because if somebody cuts it off, it'll, instead of speeding up like a human driver would do, it'll stop, it'll give way. And so unless we...
But Google's algorithm could change that.
Well,
they could make their cars more rude.
I mean, that's one solution, but the one that would actually give us the potential for success is to avoid what happened to streetcars. As soon as we let human-driven cars drive on the tracks, that ended streetcars as an efficient and good choice for people to take, because the cars get in the way. So we have to keep humans out of the way of the autonomous cars, not the other way around, at least at the outset.
So in other words, you're proposing that instead of evolving into a system that maybe 20%, then 30% of the cars are autonomous, you have to go to places that are all or nothing.
Well, all the benefits accrue when you have the driverless technology done. That's when you don't have to park anymore. You don't need to own your car anymore. Car ownership really doesn't make sense when you can have a purpose-built vehicle for the trip you want to take. And, it's like buying minutes for your phone or something. You'll get time in whatever type of vehicle you need. The ripple effect of having a shared autonomous model is environmental improvements, efficiency. We use the infrastructure we have now so much more efficiently.
But isn't it very hard to make a radical leap all at once? Don't we have
It's impossible. Yeah, that's why you need to start out with some kind of protected, it's like protected bike lanes work better for bicyclists and actually for traffic flow than regular bike lanes.
You
need
think
protected...
we have to redesign? I'm trying to imagine the streets, take San Francisco, where I've seen autonomous cars going. How do you redesign a inner city street to have autonomous vehicle lanes that are protected?
The same way you create, a lane that's on a street that is normally accommodates parking, but during peak hours you say no parking there. We're going to let traffic flow there. I mean, we've historically made spaces in our cities for new rules for driving. Seleta has demonstrations, projects all over Los Angeles that are doing that for express buses, for bicyclists. There's no reason why we couldn't do that.
So how would you start it, Selena? Would you start it on expressways and say these 2 lanes are AV only?
No, I think that, first of all, I think the infrastructure is going to play a role. I think that when you have 12 different softwares out there competing with, my Aunt Clarine in her 2006 red Cadillac that she is definitely not giving up anytime soon, to Ed's point, that infrastructure itself, the traffic signals and the other things that we have out in the roadway are going to be the things that communicate with the vehicles and that try and sort of manage this transition, because the transition is going to be rough. I think that, to your point, the place where we're most comfortable with the idea of a priced, optimized network is actually on freeways. People are comfortable with toll lanes, with hot lanes, with dynamic pricing, and so there may be a way to start that, because I think that freight and goods movement is where we're going to see the broadest adoption the soonest, which is going to have major implications for the economy out in rural America and other places. But then I think you're going to see that model will have to be applied to cities. The pricing and optimized network of streets that really is for autonomous vehicles that you pay a little more for if you're by yourself in your Tesla than if you are sharing a ride or you're in an autonomous transit vehicle.
Do you think that there will soon be autonomous vehicles that have no passengers in them, that are delivering things like, whether it's goods and services, Amazon?
I have to say, from my own perspective, I sure hope not, because I think that's much harder for us to price, regulate, and manage than a model where we're still using vehicles primarily to move people. Because I think that the most precious thing we have in cities is space. And if we are giving it away continually to moving small sort of deliveries around our cities, I think we're going to quickly get into a place where all of the benefits that we may have from a sustainability or safety perspective begin to rapidly diminish.
How do cities look totally redesigned if autonomous vehicles become common?
Well, actually, I'll play on what you just asked, because one of the cool things that autonomous cars can do is they can go places without people. And instead of parking and searching for parking is a huge source of congestion in cities. Los Angeles County devotes something like 250 square miles to parking.
Acres.
I mean, you could fit. You could
What's
fit
that?
4 acres. I'm sorry. You can fit multiple San Franciscos in the space that LA devotes to parking. If an autonomous car drops you off at the curb to where you want to go and then moves on to pick up the next passenger, you eliminate a lot of the need for that space, the search for parking congestion effect. So
you definitely see cars driving themselves empty as in between two passengers. They drop one off, then they go a few blocks to pick somebody up.
It's Uber without the driver, I mean,
Right.
in that model. So
Does that need a different infrastructure?
it needs less infrastructure. And if it's not a mix of humans who need a much larger margin of error than a robot-guided car, you can have narrower lanes, you can have less distance between vehicles as they're traveling.
You may not need curbs. A lot of the infrastructure that we put out there is to protect people walking from people driving, right? A lot of the concrete infrastructure that we have in the right-of-way, what if the streets of the future are curbless and they don't need that kind of protection? What if you're able to, devote less space to traffic signals, and the 130 surface parking lots that the Department of Transportation owns in Los Angeles can be devoted to something else?
Your city, though, and your mother, I guess it was with the Cadillac, or was that your grandmother?
My Aunt Clara.
Your Aunt Clara, sorry. It's probably more associated with cars as part of the culture than any other city. In this vision that y'all were just painting, you don't have a car that is your car. Cars kind of pick you up. They may be a little bubble-like car, but it's not a car where you hang your, Los Angeles Rams, whatever paraphernalia. Will people give up owning individual cars?
I think that you're already seeing individual vehicle ownership decline, so that's a trend that's already out there, and especially younger people delaying getting their driver's licenses. When you give them a choice between a smartphone and a car, they pick the smartphone. They consider, driving a distraction to texting. People are less and less interested in driving, even in Los Angeles. It's not a place where driving is a joy anymore. It's a drag, and it's something very personal that you design your life around. So I think that that model is changing in cities. But my Aunt Clarine, to use the example, actually lives in Mississippi. She's an Ole Miss Rebel fan, just to be real clear. And her model of driving long distances with really no congestion, that's where I think we're going to see it maybe slower to change.
I do want to send her my sympathies. LSU has a really good team, but they shouldn't have beaten them that badly this weekend.
Thanks, Walter.
All right. Roll Tide.
I heard that. Hotty toddy.
How do you do tailgate parties at Ole Miss football games with autonomous vehicles?
That is such a legitimate question.
Yeah, okay,
Such a legitimate question.
We're doomed, you're right.
So how do you avoid the 50-50 problem that we get into a city like Pittsburgh in a year or two in which 50% is autonomous and 50% ain't? Isn't that the worst of all worlds?
It is yeah. Well, and it's with the technology itself, that's the worst of both worlds too. If you have some autonomy, but you expect humans to take over in an emergency, witnessed the fatality in the Tesla car. I mean, that's really a bad model. And the same goes for the landscape. If you have 50% human drivers and no protection for the law-abiding robot. I mean, the Google car gets rear-ended all the time because it's the only car on the street following the speed limit. You know, those are the kinds of accidents we're seeing mostly. And unless we plan now for that 50-50 moment, I don't think it's just a couple years away. I think it's, you know, a decade or more away before we would get even close to that. But we have to figure out how to do that now, and cities can be the laboratory for testing out this kind of mix. Do we want separate lanes? Do we want times of day where autonomous cars are advantaged? You know, you get to go in the fast lane, or you could think of many incentives to try and encourage that mix to flow, and also protect the emerging technology from the primitive human-driven
But don't
technology.
you think you can think about the model where around, you know, the way we smog our cars in California? You know, that was a way to sort of slowly over time get the older fleet up to the same standards as the newer vehicles. And I can imagine when, you know, I'm going to say the tipping point is probably 25% of the fleet is autonomous, that we begin to require older vehicles to at least be outfitted, retrofit with some kind of Bluetooth device that can communicate with the driverless vehicle, and that within the city proper, you know, you have to be in a certain mode, which again is sort of the reason why cities need to be very, very overt about the outcomes that we want.
You know, I want to pick up on what you said on timing, because when we first heard about autonomous vehicles 4 or 5 years ago, people said, it'll be, you know, in 20 years, this is something that's happening. Then a couple of years ago, it became, oh, this is happening in the next couple of years. And I now can't quite tell. I was in San Francisco, got into an autonomous vehicle, did it at the Google thing too. I hear Pittsburgh has autonomous Ubers starting this month. So like, whoa, that came much faster than we thought. But now you're saying it actually might be much slower than we think.
We're in the gee whiz stage where we're seeing small uses of the technology. There's a philosophical debate, I guess, in the Silicon Valley and Detroit centers of where this is happening now. Do we want to treat it like a new feature and deploy autonomy that way, or do we want to just take away the steering wheel and make it the robots completely in charge right from the get-go? It's two very different ideas. One is more palatable, maybe, to more people who like to drive or like associated with freedom and choice, driving your own car. But others, particularly those who are mobility challenged, who maybe can't drive for one reason or another, the Silicon Valley approach, where the car doesn't have a steering wheel anymore, is going to work really well for them.
But isn't it safer to take the steering wheel out altogether than to blend the model?
Well, that's one argument. The other is...
Well, wait, I'm asking the question, though.
Yes,
I mean,
okay, you're asking me?
Yeah, I'm asking you. I don't know.
90%, over 90% of the fatal crashes in the U.S. are caused by human recklessness, human distraction, or, you know, or people getting in car after they have too much to drink. I mean, that's it.
How many people
Not too many
got
robots do
killed
that.
last year in cars accidents? United States.
Approximately 38,000, and
And-
2.5 million serious injuries, serious enough to go to the emergency room. So the calculation I like to say is that if you take all the dead and wounded, U.S. dead and wounded, in all the wars we've ever fought, that total number will be less than the casualties on 1 year on the roads in America. That's epic. You know, and people always say, "Oh, that can't be right." And I got into an argument with the New York Times about this, which probably wasn't a good idea. But they actually looked at the numbers, and it's true. I mean, it's horrific.
And you even mentioned that we had anti-war movements over last, but we don't have, at least for the past 80 years, we don't have anti-driving movements.
Oh no, we consider that the cost of doing business. We've normalized that level of carnage, that violence on the highway, which is now there's an argument: should we even call them accidents? No, that we should call them crashes, because almost none of the carnage on our roads and highways is accidental. It's reckless, or it's criminal, or it's...
It used to be called motor
bad choices.
murders, wasn't it?
Motor killings.
Motor killings.
Motor violence, motor killings.
I mean, I read this in your book, so I don't want to pretend I knew that until last night. But that early on they were called motor killings, and I guess the automobile industry tried to sanitize it a bit, and it was called auto accidents or something instead. So do you think that you could make the public safety argument be the main one? Because I think it cuts the other way at the moment, that people are afraid of these things.
The number one cause of death, I think, for children in America is automobiles. I mean, I would make the argument, this is to save our kids, and it would be a true argument.
Yeah, we lose more people to traffic violence every year in the city of Los Angeles than to gang-related homicides. And that's not to diminish gang violence, but to consider the amount of outrage and architecture built around trying to combat gang violence. And I think you see different cities in the U.S. adopting something called Vision Zero, which is a goal to get to zero traffic deaths, and trying to shine a light on some of this real culture change, which is what it's going to take. And I think people can feel overwhelmed by it. But when you look at something like seat belts, or child safety seats, or airbags, or even drunk driving, those are all things that, happened over time through culture change. To your question about should there be a steering wheel, I think the firm answer is no, because when you have it's called human in the loop, where the car drives itself until it hits what I'll politely call an oh crap moment, and then it wants the human to take over, and the human says, that's cool, I'm just going to finish this email first, or the human's in the back seat asleep. I mean, this is real human factors research. It's hard for our brains to partially give up control but stay vigilant. And so I think it has to be all or nothing.
Let me end with the question of a vision for, say, 8 to 10 years out that what you see as being more likely. One would be people would still own cars. They would buy their car, they would find their Tesla, they would, like the car that they have and put things in the glove compartment. And those vehicles would be autonomous, perhaps even with the ability, if you want to drive it yourself, you can, but you can switch it on to auto mode. A second would be a lot of private companies, such as Uber's, having autonomous fleets that they own. And people don't really need to have cars. You just order up a car on demand. I guess a related model might be sort of the Airbnb model, which is people have cars, but they just let them float out there when they're not using them for other people to use. And I guess finally another way to do it would be make it all public. So it's all integrated into the rail and bus and vans and cars are integrated into one transportation system, equitable for all, so that you could pay a little bit more, but it would be generally equitable that wherever you lived, you would get the right type of vehicle to get you where you wanted to go. What do you think is most likely, and what do you think are most preferable of those choices?
Well, most preferable is the last one, no question. And we laid out in Los Angeles a transportation technology strategy, which is a public policy and infrastructure investment roadmap to get to that outcome. And a piece of that outcome, which is absolutely critical, is that it allows you to build spaces for people, that it allows you to free up space to create plazas, to create public spaces, to create protected bike networks, to create opportunities for all the things that we love about cities. Most likely, without any intervention, is probably the model where the private side sort of takes over mobility in our cities. And there's some combination of vehicle ownership and sort of private models delivering service in the city.
The most wasteful activity we engage in is how we transport ourselves. I mean, think about the use case for our cars. In most cases, is one person in a car that can carry 5 or 6 people and 8 suitcases and take you on a really long trip. But mostly we're driving alone in our cars and going, a handful of miles. So the potential to take that horrible investment we're making in the way we get around now and turn it into something much more efficient, this shared autonomous fleet of cars that somewhere in the distant future maybe we can have. It's game changing. It's the first big reset of our transportation practices since, well, I mean, since we started designing our cities to accommodate cars instead of people. But the path to getting there is unknown and murky. I think a place like Los Angeles, more likely a place like Singapore or somewhere like that, is going to say, hey, we're going full throttle ahead on an autonomous transportation model, and let's see what happens. And once one community accomplishes it and it starts to make sense and be an environmental and economic winner, I think that's will
And which
trigger
city?
a cascade.
Real quick, bet on a city.
In the U.S.,
Yeah, Pittsburgh,
Portland maybe.
Portland,
Los Angeles.
Los Angeles. Seleta, Edward, thank you all very much. Appreciate it.